Thanks a lot. Thank you, Florence and Evgeny, for the organization of this nice event in a nearly sunny environment. So my talk today will be at the interface between statistics, machine learning, and computer science. So I hope everyone can learn something interesting. And yes, I will speak about graph alignment, which is one of these main problems in inference on graphs, but I will mainly dedicate a substantial part of the talk to introduce this broad topic, which is inference on graphs. Right? And then I will talk about this problem more in depth, giving some fundamental and computational results. And if time permits, I will also conclude with an open note, but this is just if I can fit in. Okay, so first of all, inference problems on graphs. Okay, this first slide is just to convince you, if need be, that graphs are ubiquitous in the real world data. So graphs and point clouds in this talk will be a little bit the same, because I will call a graph just a set of vertices which can be labeled. Okay, you can have coordinates on the vertices, for instance, and some of them are just linked by edges. Okay, and these edges can also be weighted. So you have several examples of fields where graph-shaped data appears. Of course, social media, image processing, computational biology, and this last one is in natural language processing, and in many deep learning approaches. One of the key steps is to embed your data. That can be complex, like an image or a word here, for instance. You embed a word in a RD space and you represent it as a d-dimensional vector, right? So you can consider this as a graph or just a point cloud, putting edges that may encode, for instance, the distance between the embeddings. Okay, so on all of these objects, there are many natural questions that I will give a few examples of now, which can actually be phrased as optimization problems. Okay, so let's look at a few questions. So the first one is, okay, how can I optimally cluster the node set into two groups? Okay, very natural question. This is, okay, if I give you a graph, I ask you for the best split, and you can solve this optimization problem. This is called mean bisection. Okay, I ask you for a bisection, a partition of the node set, such that there is a minimal number of edges crossing these two parts. Okay, that's the first one. Okay, another one could be, okay, I want to find some dense subgraphs in my data, maybe because I want to, I don't know, to sum up my graph with a few nodes or something like that. So can I find a largest subgraph with a given density? This is another optimization problem. And if we think of point clouds, maybe an even more very famous question is, what are the optimal directions in which to project my data so that I can reduce the dimensionality of my data? Well, I think you know this problem, right? This is just PCA. Okay, so I put it in green because usually this problem here is quite easy, actually, if we know how to diagonalize the matrix that appears. This optimization problem is tractable, whereas, as you can imagine, the two first ones in practice, in all generality, are quite difficult. Okay, and this is now what I want to emphasize. Some of these problems, actually many of these problems, are difficult. I will define how difficult they are, but the thing is, they are difficult because we are seeing them, we are defining them in all generality, in the worst case approach. Okay, meaning that I can ask the questions I just presented for any graph, and these questions can be difficult on some of these instances, right, of course. So because some of these instances may be atypical. By atypical, I mean, for instance, if you want to cluster your graph in two parts, maybe you have a graph that has no real communities in it. okay? Because it has no geometry, nothing happens in your graph, so it may be difficult to actually find the optimizer for this task because there are many, or because there are many of them that are quite close, and this can be a mess computationally. Okay, because actually your underlying instance is not very typical for the problem you want to solve. So this is the problem of the worst case approach, is that if you want to guarantee some result on an algorithm, on the worst case approach, it will be of course harder than if you know a bit more about the data you want to apply it to. This is my main message of this talk, so if you understand this, everything is clear. Okay, so there's a price, that's why I talk about the price of the worst case approach. For instance, this mean bisection problem that I just presented, in the worst case, it's an NP-hard problem, right? There is no polynomial time algorithm that is known to succeed in all generality for this problem. Okay, so this is sad. So I will give you a few remarks now that will motivate a change of point of view on these problems. And I will now switch to another perspective on these kind of problems. So here is a few remarks that may guide us, okay? If we want to depart from this worst case approach, we can think actually that in practice, real world data from the problem I want to look at actually contains some significant signal in it. For the community detection problem, for instance, if I apply it to a real world graph, that means that I kind of philosophically assume that there are communities in the graph, okay? Otherwise I would not study the problem. Okay, so these are typical instances where there is a signal in it. Okay, so we can assume that actually the set of instances on which we're going to look at, on which we're going to define the problem, contains some signal. That's the first thing. Okay, and second, we would like to create instances that are typical in some sense. So typical means, okay, imagine that I have a signal in my data. I know where it stands, and there is some kind of noise that perturbates it, okay? It's like linear regression, if you want, the basic model for linear regression. You assume there is, there is a slope, and then you perturbate your samples, okay? So this is just the purpose of this remark. So we will assume now that data, we will look at a different problem actually, where data is now generated according to a generative model that contains some signal. Okay, so for the community detection problem, it will be communities. The signal is communities, and we want to recover it. Okay, does this make sense? This new approach? Okay, so this is often called the mean case approach, because now we're not looking at worst case instances. We know that the data has some kind of community structure, some kind of dense subgraph in it, some kind of direction in which there is a significant signal. Okay. And this is called the planted approach. Okay. So in the planted approach, as I explained, this is a variant of the initial problem you had, where now the data is randomly generated. And moreover, we have a notion of what is the solution in the data, because we use the structure to generate the data. Okay, so there is an underlying signal that I want to recover. This is called S star. So for instance, in the community detection problem, I can imagine now that my graphs are generated according to the popular stochastic block model, where you have a graph of n nodes, and each node has a community, which is sampled, okay, at random, say probability 1/2 to be in the first or the second community. And the graph is not worst case, it's a typical random graph where actually the probability of connection between U and V depend on the community. So this probability will be P if they belong to the same community, and Q if they have different communities. Okay, so here is an example of what a stochastic block model looks like in the case where there are two communities. So for the sake of presentation here, I cheated 2 times actually. I colored the points. I tell you which community they belong to, and I also represent the graph so that you see clearly that there are two communities. But in in general, I can't have any canonical way of representing my graph. Okay, so this is just for presentation. Just to show you that these graphs indeed will contain a community structure. Okay, and now the goal is a little bit different from what we had at the beginning. Remember, we had this mean bisection combinatorial optimization problem. Now it's more of a statistical flavor because we observe an instance and we want to recover the signal. Here the signal is sigma star, the communities. Okay, so actually these two objectives may differ. Okay, it's not clear that sigma star is also the solution of mean bisection. It's not really clear. But by changing this point of view, we go from a difficult problem to a statistical inference problems. And also, a very nice thing about these kind of models, what we like in it, is that they have parameters, okay, that quantify the hardness of the problem as well. Here, P and Q are the different probabilities to be connected intra and inter-community. Okay, and if you may think of extreme cases, for instance, if P equals Q, you don't see the communities because nothing happens depending on these communities. And another extreme case would be like P equals 1 and Q equals 0. Well, in this case, you have two disconnected cliques. It's pretty obvious to see what are the communities, okay? But it kind of interpolates between these two extreme cases, if you like. Okay. So this is an example among the wide family of inference problems on graphs. Okay, so to sum up the planted approach, it provides many advantages because there are typical instances, so that means they are easier to deal with in generality. And you also have a notion of ground truth. What is the signal you want to recover? So that's actually very helpful when you want to train an algorithm, because you give it the graph, okay, and then you want it to output S star, but you know S star, so you kind of know what is the error he made, okay. And also, it's usually very easy to sample this kind of graphs or this kind of models, so it's very nice to get free training data for any algorithm you may think of, okay. And of course, there are parameters that actually play a role in controlling the level of noise and the level of hardness of the problem. So now we're happier than a few slides ago. I hope you are happier too. Okay, so I will, now that I introduced the setting, maybe if there are questions on this general approach, it's a good time to ask them. Okay. So I will delve into one of these fundamental problems, which I will describe now. So this is the topic of graph alignment. Okay, so what is graph alignment? So in our problem now, we will have two graphs, and this problem arises from a very famous one, which is graph isomorphism. Okay, so you have two graphs, and you want to find a bijection between the two node sets of these graphs. So imagine they have the same number of nodes, okay, such that this bijection preserves adjacency. That's exactly the graph isomorphism problem. Maybe the computer scientists in the audience will know a lot about this fundamental problem. So we wonder whether there is a bijection that preserves adjacency, meaning, in fact, these two graphs are the same, right, up to isomorphism. Okay, so in this example, they are, and I show you what is the bijection, okay, but in general, of course, finding such a bijection or even just saying whether there exists one, this is very difficult. This is a problem which stands in the NP class, okay, meaning there is no polynomial time algorithm up to now which is known to succeed for this task. And it's also a very intriguing example among this family of problems because it is somehow intermediate between being polytime solvable and being NP complete, meaning being a good representative of the NP class. So that's why there are many threads of research on this problem because it's believed to be a key theoretical problem to look at conjectures like P equals NP, for instance, and this kind of stuff. So in our setting, we ask a slightly different question, but not that different, you'll see, because we may consider cases where actually the graphs are no longer isomorphic, okay? So maybe they are quasi-isomorphic, okay? You see I deleted some edges, I added a few ones, okay? And we kind of asking the same, more or less the same question, meaning, okay, is there a bijection now that maybe it does not preserve all edges, but most edges? That's the question we're looking at. So what does it mean mathematically? Well, okay, first there are a lot of applications actually of this kind of problem. You can easily imagine that if you're able to align two graphs, then you're able to recover information on the second graph thanks to the first one. Okay, imagine there is one of these graphs that is anonymized, for instance. The other one is not. If you can align these graphs, well, you can de-anonymize the first graph. This is not a very beautiful application, maybe, but it's one of them. Actually, this is one of the first applications that gave rise to research on this problem, because so these authors, Narayanan and Smatnikov, are able to de-anonymize some large networks that were thought to be well anonymized, and therefore showing a problem in the anonymization procedure. Okay, but many other fields actually look at this problem. I'm thinking of computational biology, for instance, where you have many large graphs in this field. One of them is the protein interaction graph that you can actually model from a cell. You look at all the proteins, you look at how they chemically interact, and this gives you a notion of what is the interaction in your cell between proteins. And if you are able to align these kind of big graphs, even across different species, sometimes they do this also, like you take a mouse cell and a human cell and you kind of align these two protein interaction networks, you can infer some properties on what is the role of this protein for the mouse and this protein for the human, and the roles may be comparable if you're able to align these graphs. Okay, just a few applications. Okay, and now let me formalize the question. So we have two graphs, okay, with the same number of nodes, and we want to find this bijection that preserves most edges. And here, what I call an optimal solution is a solution that minimizes this cost over here. Okay, and this cost, if you look at it, is just the number of edge disagreements between the first graph G and the second graph H, relabeled by this permutation F. Okay, so this, in the case where the graphs are isomorphic, actually, this can be, there is a F such that the cost is 0, which is the isomorphism. But in generality, maybe the optimal cost is not 0, and we still want to minimize it. Okay. Another way to rephrase this kind of problem is to actually phrase it as a maximum optimization problem. And you see the function, so A and AG and AH are just the adjacency matrices of the graphs. And this kind of formulation is an instance of a famous problem in the literature, which is called the quadratic assignment problem. Quadratic because pi, the permutation matrix, appears 2 times here in the objective. Of course, as you may have guessed, this problem is NP hard in the worst case as well, because it's even harder than graph isomorphism. So, okay. So this is our optimization problem in this setting. And now, as you are already experts of the field, you know that we are going to look at the planted setting for this problem, to avoid this kind, to hopefully avoid this kind of complications. And that's what I'm going to describe right now. So the graphs in our planted view on the problem are now random. Okay, they will be generated according to generative model, but in this model I will plant a solution, and in this case I will plant a permutation which will be the correct solution to the problem. Then, of course, I will add some noise, etc. But this is supposed to be echoing the first slides, okay? This is the planted setting for this problem. And what I am going to, okay, and also I want to recover the signal, okay, with high probability when n goes to infinity. N is the size of the graphs. I will look at large graphs and asymptotic results on this. The model that I will consider now for this problem is the correlated Erdős-Rényi model that I will describe just now. So now I do this in two steps. First step is to generate two graphs that will be aligned and that will be correlated. They are correlated in the sense of edges. Okay? They carry a large intersection. And then second step, I take my two graphs and I just relabel one of them according to pi star, which is the permutation that is the solution. Okay? So a good way to see how to generate aligned graphs is simply to look at one graph with colored edges. Okay? So edges in this single graph may be two colored, meaning that they will belong to both graphs, or they can be just blue, first graph, red, second graph, or just no edges. Okay? So that's the model here. So we generate the two graphs with the same node set independently. Every edge is either two-colored with probability q times s. I will describe the parameters next. And with probability q times 1 minus s, we get only a blue edge. And with the same probability, we get only a red edge. And with the remaining probability, there's a non-edge. So here is what it can look like. Okay, you have a substantial part of the graph which is an intersection between G and G prime. Okay, G inter G prime is denoted like that, the intersection graph. And then second step, I will take my two graphs separately. So you see that here, if I show you those two graphs, it's pretty obvious what is the alignment because I didn't do anything. But of course, before showing it to the statistician, I relabel according to some uniform permutation, pi star. I relabel the second graph. Okay. And now I show you these two graphs, and it's a bit less obvious what is the alignment and how to find it. Okay, is that clear? Okay, good. So I will give a few remarks just to make sure everyone, we understand the same thing. So Q here in the model is the marginal edge probability. Of course, if you look at the model, you add QS and Q1 minus S, you have Q, which is just the probability of one edge in one graph. Okay. So these two graphs have the same marginals. We can assume that S equals Q, which is assuming positive correlation. And this model actually interpolates between also two extreme cases. The case where S equals Q, if you look at it, it's the case where the graphs are independent, totally independent. Okay? And the case where S equals 1, this is the case where the graphs are strictly isomorphic. So there is an intersection, which is the total graph. Okay? A very nice quantity to look at first when you deal with this kind of problems is the so-called posterior distribution of the signal given the data. So what's the probability that the underlying alignment is pi? You can compute it. You can believe me, it's one of these kind of, it has this form. And the quantity here is some positive constant. So if I want a max likelihood estimator, I want to maximize this kind of stuff. And maybe this is reminiscent of something. No? Okay. This is exactly the quadratic assignment problem that we had in the first place, when I described the optimization problem in the worst case. Okay. So there's a link quite strong actually between those two visions, those two point of views. Okay. So the optimization problem is actually the max likelihood estimator in my model. Okay, so in the rest of the talk, to describe the problem, I will focus on a regime where the graphs are sparse. Okay, this is quite coherent with real-world data, where actually many graphs are just sparse. That means that they have a constant mean degree. Okay, so Q has to be of the form lambda over n for this to be satisfied. Okay, so that means that the average degree in my graph is lambda, and the correlation S will be a constant, not scaling with n. So for the rest of the talk, you can just keep in mind these three parameters: number of the nodes n, mean degree lambda, and correlation S. All the results then will depend on these parameters that quantify the hardness of the problem. So what's the goal exactly? Okay, we said we want to recover the signal, that's fine, but how well can we do this? Let's look at, in this regime, let's look at what G and G prime, which are two aligned graphs, look like. Okay, so we see that there are some things happening here. So there are actually a lot of isolated nodes in my data. This is typical because the graphs are random and the degree is constant, so you can easily find out that there will be a lot of isolated points. The problem is isolated points, there is no hope to align them well. I think you can agree on that. If I give you a graph which is just empty, well, you cannot do anything better than just, telling me at random how to align them, but that's all. Just this to say that actually there are some trivial automorphisms in the graphs, and this makes the recovery of the signal impossible if we seek for exact recovery. I cannot recover all pi star. So the only thing is to recover a substantial fraction of it. So that means I want to be able to match a substantial fraction of the nodes across the two graphs. This fraction won't be 1, but the highest possible is what I look for. Okay, so I will not going into the details, but just give you the typical results that we have for this problem. That are also, these questions are typical for a lot of these inference problems on graphs, right? So this is, if you like, an illustration of what are the main challenges and the main questions in this setting. Okay, so first of all, I will just define what is partial recovery, because I mentioned that I wanted to do partial recovery. So partial recovery is basically not outputting a permutation, because you know that you cannot recover it totally, okay? So you just output a partial mapping, meaning you have this set C here that is a subset of the nodes of the first graph that you think you are able to match, that your algorithm thinks he's able to match. It's part of the output of the algorithm, if you like, okay? So I won't say I output a permutation, I just say I output some pairs of nodes that I think are matched. And there are measures to tell you if the performance is good or not. Okay, the first one is the overlap. So what is the fraction of the nodes that are correctly matched among this node set C? And the error fraction is just the fraction of the nodes that are not correctly matched. Okay, it's the complementary quantity here. So we are interested in achieving partial recovery, meaning that there is some fraction eta that I can guarantee the overlap will be larger than eta, with probability 1 when n goes to infinity. And in the same direction, in the opposite direction actually, I also want the error fraction to be vanishing when n goes to infinity with probability 1. Okay, n is the number of nodes. So in other words, I want to output a fraction of pairs for which I'm pretty sure that I won't make mistakes in matching them. Okay? So this is partial recovery. This is what we seek for. Just from a hand-wavy point of view, it's just I want to match a fraction of the nodes without any error. Okay? So the questions in these kind of problems are always of two types. The first one is more related to statistics, I would say. It's information theory, if you like. It's a fundamental question on, without any computational restriction, is there a hope that I can find an estimator that will, for instance, guarantee that the overlap is greater than some positive fraction. This is just a question which can be rephrased as, is there enough signal in my data? What's the noise level above which the problem becomes impossible? Okay, this is really statistical because I don't care about how to compute my estimator. I just want to find out if there exists one. And of course, what's the maximal fraction in this case that I can hope for? And then the other aspect of the problem is much more computer science flavored. It's actually a computational question, meaning I have my parameters, and are there some efficient, that means polynomial time algorithms, that will succeed at outputting a partial mapping of my node sets, okay? And which one works better in practice? It's also related to you can benchmark every method. You can look at what happens in practice. One key quantity also for the rest of the talk, which will be lambda times s. Lambda times s, if you think about it in my original model, this is the mean degree in the intersection graph. The purple graph that I showed in the first place has mean degree lambda times s. And it's not difficult to see that actually this quantity governs the theoretical hardness of the problem. We'll see that in a few moments. In this slide, I give you just the information theoretic results. So I will answer the first question. What is the noise level above which this problem becomes impossible? This is the theorem. So basically, there is a negative part showing that you can always upper bound the eta you can hope for, okay? There is no, okay, for whatever value of lambda and s, there is no estimator that can achieve more than this fraction of correctly matched nodes. And what is this fraction? It can be defined in many ways, but what I just want to say is that this fraction is the typical fraction of the nodes that belong to the largest connected component of the intersection graph. Maybe a bit complicated in the first place, but an important thing is that this typical fraction, when lambda s here goes below 1, this is simply 0. This quantity is 0 if lambda s, the parameter here, is less than 1. So this means that I cannot hope for a positive fraction of the nodes to be correctly matched if lambda s is less or equal to 1. Okay, this is an impossibility result. And there is a subsequent positive result, which shows that actually if lambda s is greater than 1, then you have a totally different behavior. There is this estimator, which is the maximum likelihood estimator that actually achieves partial recovery, okay? So it's feasible in theory. But in this case, even this one does not recover any positive fraction of the signal. So you see there is a sharp transition here in this problem. For lambda s equals 1, above this we can do it theoretically, below this we cannot hope for anything. I just want you to note that this is a very difficult estimator to compute in practice. This is just theoretical. This one is the quadratic assignment problem. I don't want such an estimator in practice, but it works theoretically. So a way that people like to sum up their results in this kind of problems is the so-called phase diagram. Okay, so you represent your space of parameters and you want to partition it in different phases where the problem, depending on the parameter, may be impossible, easy, or hard. We will see this later, but for now, we have at least one phase. We know that below this, in this red area here, the problem is impossible. Okay, that's what I know. The question is, what happens above? And this is the second question, okay? Is there a computationally efficient method to recover max signal when I am in the possible phase? Okay? So I will briefly describe one possible approach to be efficient when you want to recover your signal. In this problem, we are in the sparse regime. So the graphs, actually, I showed you some examples. If you look at them locally, if you look at what happens around the vertex in these graphs, you will see a tree locally. Some of you may know this. If you studied a bit of random graphs, this is quite standard as a result. But this is quite nice for us because we can, in order to be efficient, we can propose a local method. A method that only looks at what happens locally around my nodes. So you are at a node I in G, you are at a node U in H, and you wonder, are these nodes matched or not? You want to create a procedure to decide, okay? And since you observe trees, then you can say something, maybe I can compute a score on these two trees, telling me if they are somehow close or not. This is the spirit of the score. And if these trees are close enough, I will say, okay, I can match I and U because I think they belong, they actually matched by pi star because their neighborhoods are close enough. Okay, because if you remember the model, whenever you're matched or whenever you're aligned, then obviously your neighborhood will contain some significant intersection because of the model. Okay, so this is the spirit of this procedure. So we have to test whether these trees are close enough or not, meaning correlated or not. Okay. This is another problem, in fact, actually, a problem on trees, a hypothesis problem on trees, where you have two hypotheses, okay? These trees may be, so they have depth D, and they may be either independent or correlated. And actually, how are these models defined? Well, if you look at what happens where the nodes are matched, we know the distribution of these trees. Namely, it's actually Galton-Watson trees with Poisson offspring distribution, and they bear this intersection, which carries the signal, okay, when U and I are matched. But when they are not matched, we may think of the trees locally to be more or less independent. If you take two nodes on the graphs that are not matched, you explore locally not too far, then you won't intersect, and you will see, as a first approximation, independent trees. Independent with the same marginal, though. They are all Galton-Watson trees, but in the first case, they carry some intersection. And this is how I can discriminate my two hypotheses. So you see, this is a statistical hypothesis testing problem, very standard in this formulation. Pretty hard to analyze, though. Okay. And now I'm switching to another problem, which is related to the first one, but it can be studied per se. It's a hypothesis testing problem. Okay, is there an underlying intersection in my two trees or not? Okay, so I won't elaborate right now on this procedure, how to design the score. We can talk about this later if you want. The correct score to look at, in fact, is given by statistical theory. It's given by the likelihood ratio when you have an hypothesis testing. You can compute this likelihood ratio, the ratio of the probabilities, and if it's high enough, you declare that the graphs are, the trees are intersecting. If it's too low, then you don't match the vertices, okay? This is just a procedure. You're not supposed to look at this. It's just to tell you there is a way to compute these scores, okay? And this computation, if you look at this formula, it is recursive. You can do this recursively. The depth can be fixed by the practitioner. In practice, you fix it to be not too large. But, okay, you can do it recursively, compute your scores, and then look at the scores and match the nodes according to these scores. Okay, you compare this score to some threshold. So you take d of order log n, the depth of the trees has to be logarithmic. And this is just the procedure. You compute all the scores, okay, and we match given nodes, u and u prime, if and only if this score is larger than some threshold that you have chosen wisely. Okay, this method is actually polynomial time. It may not be obvious when I show you this formulation, but as soon as d is logarithmic in n, everything works well, and the method is polynomial time. And what so the result is as follows. It says that, okay, if I can find a test for correlation detection in the tree model, then I can apply this method to the graph problem and use it as an algorithm to achieve partial alignment. Okay, so you have a connection between these two problems. If you like, the tree problem is the local version of the graph problem. So that's why one needs to study the local version, analyze it, and then deduce some results for the graphs. And we actually did so. So we want to analyze what happens locally to deduce a general result for the graphs. And we have to analyze, is it easy or not to detect this correlation in trees? Okay, so that's another kind of analysis. And this analysis will give us some results on the computational hardness of the original problem on graphs. And just to present the result briefly, I need to introduce this constant, which is called alpha. So alpha is the Otter constant because it's been actually discovered by Otter in the 40s, you see. He was interested in counting the number of unlabeled trees with a given number of vertices. This is just combinatorics, okay? This number probably behaves like that. It's exponentially large in n when n goes to infinity. And the exponential rate is alpha, or 1 over alpha. And alpha is called the Otter constant. You have numerical approximation. And interestingly, in this tree problem, this constant plays a role because it appears in the phase transition going from impossible to possible. By that I mean that, okay, if the correlation is less than square root of alpha, then we prove that the problem of tree correlation detection is impossible. So there is no way I can detect the intersection tree. Whereas if S is strictly larger than this, then for lambda being the mean degree, for lambda high enough, the tree correlation test is working, and this problem is though feasible. Okay, so that's a theoretical result on what happens on trees, but it has computational implications for my polynomial time method, because whenever I'm in the second case, okay, I can apply my method, my local method, and succeed in partially recovering my signal. And you see where this transition happens at S equals square root of alpha. So we were left with this phase diagram that we can now complete, and showing that there is, in this feasible phase, theoretical feasible phase, there is a phase above S equals square root of alpha, asymptotically, where there is an easy algorithm. By easy, I mean polynomial time. There is an algorithm that works in polynomial time. So we call this phase the easy phase. Okay? But in the middle, at least for now, we don't know whether there exists a polynomial time method that works for this problem. Okay. And okay, this is not only us, actually. People have studied other methods, non-local, global, etc., and even like deep neural nets, like graph neural nets and stuff like that. And they all actually fail at the same level of correlation S, square root of alpha. So this is why we have many clues now to conjecture that this is the sign of a computational gap, and there is some hardness in this problem, because here we know that theoretically we have enough signal, thanks to this first result, but we are not able to find a method that works in polynomial time to recover it. Is that clear, the difference between hardness and feasibility? Yeah? Okay. Okay, I don't know how much time I have left. Okay, so I just want to give a few take-home messages maybe before lunch. So graph alignment in this talk is thought of as an example of what people do in these kind of areas, right, in inference on random graphs. I presented you two different types of questions, the information theory results and the computational results. All of them require, of course, some technical proofs that I eluded in this talk. And looking at a local method for this problem, often we are So in this case, it's true. We actually end up with another problem in trees here. And we analyzed this correlation detection problem in trees. And this gives us a local algorithm. I call it message passing because the computation of the costs are recursive. So it can be thought of as a message passing method as well for the initial task, right? Many things are left untold, but feel free to chat if you want. I'll be very happy to answer your questions, and I think I will conclude here, saying that there are many extensions that can be looked at for this kind of problem. We may think of other models, and also another problem which is even more applied, I think, and even that has many applications in real-world data sets. It's a problem where now you assume that the data is just 2-point clouds, okay? So think of embeddings in RD. And you observe these 2-point clouds, but Y and X. And Y is just a deformation of X plus some noise. What's the transformation of X here? First, you use pi star to relabel the vertices of X. Okay, so X is a set of n vectors in RD, and you use Q star to do an orthogonal transformation on your point cloud. This is a bit different than the graph alignment because here you have two things. You have first a permutation, then an orthogonal transformation. Whereas for graph alignment, here you had also another permutation because you permuted rows and columns. Here you just permute rows, say, okay. Anyway, and this problem is thought to be a bit easier, and it has many applications, specifically in natural language processing, where people use this to do automatic translation, of course, because if you're able to embed your words to align your point clouds, then you may think, okay, in this example, you see that German words are aligned with English words. And this brings a method to do automatic translation, for instance, many others. This is called Procrust-Wasserstein alignment, and this is a growing field as well. Right. I will let you go to lunch now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luca.
Hi, thank you for your talk. That's very interesting. As I saw, you mentioned the graph alignment problem usually assumes that we have an equal size of the node set.
Yes.
But usually, if we are only able to align only part of the nodes or edges, is it possible to extend your method to an uneven size of the graph?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking it. Actually, yes, it has been done, and it's currently being done. It's called the what I call the asymmetric case. Maybe it's not the correct wording for that. So you may be able only to have graphs that have different sizes, and you want to align a little graph with a bigger one. Okay, so you want to inject somehow structure into another. Okay, and this kind of method is, for instance, the algorithm that I described, the local method, is directly applicable to that case because once again you look at what happens locally. So you don't look at the entire graph. So yes, it could be applied to uneven cases, as you said. Yes.
Thank you for the talk. So you assume that each vertex has an equal distribution of probability of its number of edges.
Yes.
But I think there are many real-world graphs that has like a small world property, and it seems to be easier in that case. So do you think we can extend the algorithm or adapt it to have results in that case that would be easier?
Great question, thank you. Yes, so indeed the Erdős-Rényi model, there's no geometry in it. Everyone has the same probability to be connected. It's easy for computations, but it's not very fitted to real-world data. So I cheated a bit when I said that this model was... yes, so in the case where the graphs have geometry, so as you say, small world properties or simply they are sampled according to an underlying geometry. Indeed, the problem is easier because locally there are the variations of what happens locally is higher than in the Erdős-Rényi graph. Okay, but there are other problems to apply this local method. Maybe it should be a bit modified and adapted because the tree-like property may not hold. And when you are not a tree locally, maybe these kind of computations are harder, but still a local method based on what happens locally, I think could be investigated. Thank you.
A quick question. My question is a bit more technical, but in the square root of alpha threshold for the testing problem on trees,
Yes.
there. Okay, so it's information theoretic threshold, but there is no computational gap there. Like your method already gives it. Like,
so it depends on what. Okay, it depends on what you. Okay, it depends on what.
Easy in the second.
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, so in this problem, there is there is no n. There is only a d. Right? D being the depth of the tree, and you want this test to work asymptotically in d. The problem is this is only info theoretical because this computation it's not polynomial in d. Okay, so it's not polynomial in d, but in our case we only need d equals log n, so that's where we have an efficient method. But yeah, good question. This is just info theoretical, and the question of hardness is still open. And yeah, and I believe actually there might be some. So this problem per se is it's also intriguing. We were surprised that actually, to our knowledge, no one had looked at that before. So.
Hello again. Can I ask another question? So I see that you mentioned some of the polynomial time methods, and I'm aware of another method that can be solved in polynomial time, which is called the Hungarian algorithm for assignment problem. Is there any way that this could be applied to the graph matching problem?
Okay, good, very good. So the Hungarian method, I won't show the slide, it's too far away. But the Hungarian method is, okay, the Hungarian algorithm is a method to solve some assignment problems that take linear form. So these are problems where you have vectors, for instance, and you just relabel. For instance, it's more applied to your point clouds. Okay, I can maybe show this. It's better than. So the Hungarian algorithm will be very useful in this problem. In this problem, if I know Q star, okay, the only thing I have to look for is pi star, and finding the best pi star, it's a linear assignment problem, and the Hungarian algorithm works polynomially, indeed, for the linear assignment problem. The problem is here in graph alignment, as I showed, it's not linear, and it's not Hungarian algorithm that works. Because if you like, you have n squared in your matrix, in your graph, in your adjacency matrix, you have n squared entries, okay? And it's not a permutation of n squared numbers that you look for in graph alignment. It's a permutation that takes the form of a permutation of size n. So it's not linear in the objective. Thank you.